During the latest Nintendo shareholders meeting, President Furukawa said something very interesting that has a lot of people freaking out and they don't know how to react to this. President Furukawa basically said that they're looking at a successor to the Nintendo 3DS, and a lot of people are confused by that. Obviously, when you look at the current landscape of Nintendo, it's very different than what we've seen in years past. The Nintendo Switch is this hybrid system, both home and on the go, and so people thought that maybe Nintendo was getting away from the dedicated handheld. But the fact that they're looking at something like a successor to the 3DS has a lot of people confused, myself included, honestly. It's a pretty puzzling thing to say. Why would you go back to your traditional business model when your new business model seems to be working so well? But the more I think about it, the more I sort of see why they could be potentially looking at it. So in this video, I want to basically explore the history of Nintendo, how they've done the two-pillar systems throughout the years, and then what the potential 3DS successor could possibly be. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and let's get into what could potentially be the successor to the 3DS, and is it a Nintendo Switch Mini?
Hey, RGT 85. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards!
So like I said, we have to look at the history of Nintendo and their systems in order to just fully grasp what President Furukawa is saying by saying they are looking at a successor to the 3DS. Because back in 1989, Nintendo pretty much changed the video game landscape by introducing the Game Boy into the world. The NES was still very successful in North America. It was the most successful system in North America. But by introducing the Game Boy, you really ushered in a new era of gamers because it was cheaper than the NES. The games were cheaper, and it was a portable system that you could take with you wherever you went. Sure, it didn't have a light on the screen or anything like that, a backlit or frontlit screen, but it still worked. We found ways around it. We found ways to play that damn Game Boy in the dark with things like worm lights and things. So basically, Nintendo pretty much kickstarted this whole two-pillar system that they've done since 1989. Of course, when the Super Nintendo was introduced, the Game Boy was still hot, but they introduced the Super Game Boy, which allowed you to play your Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo, and it was absolutely fascinating, a genius device, and really one of my favorite things that Nintendo has ever done. Maybe one day I'll do a full video on the Super Game Boy because there's so many games that took advantage of the Super Game Boy that would really blow your mind when playing it on the Super NES as opposed to playing it on the Game Boy. I think I will do a video on that one day. But as time went on, you had the N64 and the Game Boy Color working side by side, and then when the GameCube era hit, Nintendo introduced the Game Boy Advance, which of course was a cheaper alternative to the GameCube, and they once again pretty much got into the same thing that they did with the Super Nintendo by having the Game Boy Advance player. You could play your Game Boy Advance games on your GameCube by hooking up the Game Boy Advance player to the GameCube, and it was absolutely fantastic. It's pretty much considered the best way to play Game Boy Advance games still to this day on your television. And then the Wii came along, and you of course had the Nintendo DS, and that's where things got very different. The Nintendo DS was originally not supposed to replace the Game Boy line. They were actually thinking of doing a three-pillar system with the Nintendo DS, the Game Boy, and the Nintendo Wii, but the success of the Nintendo DS really sort of dictated the way that Nintendo was going, and it really propelled the handheld market once again, the likes of which we had never seen. The DS sold exponentially well, and there was a full library of games for it, a fantastic system, and coupled with the success of the casual market with the Nintendo Wii, the Nintendo DS and the Wii era was arguably the most profitable for Nintendo. But then came along the Wii U and the 3DS, both systems which struggled out of the gate. And of course, the Wii U never really recuperated, whereas the 3DS did. The 3DS, of course, got a price drop, it became cheaper, and more people gravitated towards it. But with the Nintendo Switch, everything has pretty much changed. Is there really a need for a dedicated handheld system? I think you pretty much have to look back at the way Nintendo has done things, because if it wasn't for the Nintendo 3DS, would Nintendo be in the position that they're in 2018 to still be having so much success? The 3DS essentially saved Nintendo during the Wii U era because the Wii U did not sell well. Let's just call a spade with this. The Wii U was a commercial flop, but the 3DS pretty much held on to whatever sales that Nintendo needed, and it still sold over 72 million systems. So now you're at the point where you have the Nintendo Switch, a handheld console that that you can also dock on your television and play as a home console. It's the best of both worlds. It's selling very well, but Nintendo still does have the 3DS lingering, and for President Furukawa to say that they are looking into a successor to the 3DS has a lot of people puzzled. Why would they even go this route? And you have to think about what the actual successor to the 3DS would potentially be, because let's look at the DS line going into the 3DS. The DS, of course, introduced a dual screen with a touch screen on it. The 3DS pretty much exemplified that, was a stronger system, but also had 3D capabilities. But the 3D capabilities never really caught on, because when you look at things, they also introduced the Nintendo 2DS, which did exponentially well on the market and was yet another cheaper alternative to the Nintendo 3DS and, of course, the Wii U. So is the progression of the 3DS, where can you really go with this? When you look at the way technology is right now, is there really a market for the handheld gaming market? Of course, we've seen companies like Sega, Atari, and most recently Sony enter the handheld market with things like the PSP and the Vita, but those systems did not do as well as Nintendo systems. The PSP did very well in terms of general sales, the Vita did okay as well, but Sony quickly abandoned that in favor of their PS4 to focus all their efforts on the PS4, because that's what was making them the most money. And where can you go with the 3DS? Do you introduce a 4DS? Do you introduce more screens? And where does the technology lie with that? It's very puzzling to me. A dedicated handheld system in 2019 and beyond, while you have the Nintendo Switch in your grasp, and while the Nintendo Switch is doing so well, to some people seems like a very risky move. And honestly, I could definitely see that. I understand Nintendo likes the two-pillar system, but you have to remember, they've actually merged their handheld and home console market into one market now, as far as game development is concerned within their studios. So is there really room to be making more handheld only experiences? The Nintendo 3DS does have some games coming out. Of course, the system is not dead. You have games like Luigi's Mansion and upcoming Mario and Luigi RPG exclusively for the system, but it looks like most of the efforts are being dedicated towards the Nintendo Switch, which makes sense. So I don't really foresee Nintendo going in a 4DS route or something like that, because I just don't see how much stronger they can make something like the 3DS. The 3DS development does make sense though, and it makes sense to develop things for a dedicated handheld for one main reason. You don't have to worry about HD graphics. The HD graphics are what drive the game costs up so much these days, and with something like the 3DS and every other handheld that Nintendo has released, these games have a much smaller budget. These games don't have to be these huge massive experiences in terms of high scale graphics, because they weren't HD systems. If you're introducing a new handheld into the market in 2019 or beyond, it definitely has to be something that propels handheld gaming. It definitely has to be something that's HD and that will really cut the profit margins. But then you have the Nintendo Switch, and I think this is the thing that makes the most sense, is basically taking the Switch and making what people are calling a Switch Mini. The Nintendo Switch currently is $300 in the United States, and there really is no alternative when it comes to that. It's one SKU, one system, they're all $300. But by adjusting things of the current Nintendo Switch, I think you can make a Switch Mini model that sells for about half the price. But what sort of sacrifices would you have to make on the Nintendo Switch to get it in a cheaper price range and make it something like $150, which would be an alternative to the current Nintendo Switch at $300? I think there's a few simple adjustments you can make to totally make this work. First and foremost, you would have to get rid of detachable Joy-Cons. The Joy-Con technology is very expensive in the Nintendo Switch. That's why Joy-Cons sell for $79.99 for a pair in the United States. By making non-detachable Joy-Cons, you could sort of get rid of some of that motion technology that's in those. Not many games really utilize the motion technology, and the games that do utilize it, it's completely optional, so I think that would definitely help drive the cost down. Of course, you would go with a smaller screen with this. If it is a Nintendo Switch Mini, the device itself is going to be much smaller than what we see with the Nintendo Switch. If you cut the screen size maybe in half or something like that, I think you would really cut down on costs with the system. Maybe use some lighter plastic. But I think the main thing is you would not have a dock with this system. The Nintendo Switch dock, once again, is another expensive item in the United States. By getting rid of the dock, by making it so that the Joy-Cons are non-detachable and a smaller screen with lighter plastic being used, for the system, I think you could really cut the cost almost in half of this system. Obviously, Nintendo was not taking a loss on a single Nintendo Nintendo Switch sold. They said that. They came out and said that when the Nintendo Switch was introduced. So is the Switch Mini the answer for this new portable console that Nintendo supposedly is working on? Or should they go with another dedicated handheld? I really think the Switch Mini makes the most sense. It definitely looks good from a business perspective, as consumers will be able to still buy games for the Nintendo Switch and play them on their Switch Mini. The non-detachable Joy-Cons would kind of suck, but as long as you have a docking system and the ability to use a controller on the dock, of course, you would sort of supersede that. If somebody wants to get a Switch Mini to play the Switch portably, only portably, but then does want to dabble in the home console side of things, you could totally do that. And with the Nintendo Switch Mini, it would sort of make sense. In the latest statistics, Nintendo has said that it's about 50-50 between docked users and portable users. So obviously there's a market for the portability. Imagine being able to pick up a system that plays Super Mario Odyssey for $150. Like, that would be super crazy. And I think a smart business decision for Nintendo. So I think it's time to abandon the two-pillar system. I think you just need to make a revision on the Nintendo Switch and really just go forward with that. I think that needs to be the future, because I really think that a dedicated handheld is just seen its day, and I don't think that a 4DS or something like that would really work in 2019 and beyond. But maybe I'm wrong. So let me know in the comments section down below what you think of this situation. And as always, thank you for watching this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We're doing all sorts of videos on here. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.